Good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. This is John Paul Rai, and I am coming to you from Tokyo, Japan. So this video is why I defend Star Wars Episode 3, and specifically 3. Episodes 1 and 2, I think, had some issues, and as everyone knows now, if you know anything about Star Wars, Episode 1 and 2 especially had a ton of negative feedback, and I agree with a lot of it. I agree with about half of the negative feedback against Episode 1 and 2, so there's no reason to try to defend that. I'd just be pointing out some good things along with bad things. It wouldn't really be a defense. But I don't like when people lump the prequels together, and sometimes you'll go to a Star Wars channel, or maybe you'll read a blog or something, and someone will be like, well, you know, The Force Awakens was better than the prequels, and they just lump them together in one, and I think 3 was a hell of a lot better than 1 and 2. And I would say 3 just crushes The Last Jedi and Force Awakens with no competition. There's also a pretty big difference between Episode 3 and 1 and 2, and that difference is Episode 3 gave us something that we had been wondering about for, in my case, around 15 years, and for some people, maybe longer. When I first saw Star Wars, I was 5, and then, let's say, it took me a couple of years to actually start thinking about storylines and things. But when I started to think about storylines and what-if situations, 2 of the big questions were, what would happen if Yoda fought the Emperor? And the other big question was, how did Vader get to be more machine than man? And in Episode 3, we get these questions answered. Now, how satisfying the answers is up to you, but for me, I think it was very satisfying. We knew Yoda or the Emperor was going to have kind of a draw. We had a really good idea no one was going to come out on top, because that probably wouldn't make too much sense. And that's exactly what happened, but the fight was great. We got to see them use, you know, all kind of powers. They were throwing things around with the Force, jumping around, using lightsabers. There was some dialogue. It was better than I imagined. To be honest, I imagined a little bit less of a grand scenery and so much movement, and I imagined it to be just kind of maybe like the Death Star was kind of in one room or something, but I think it superseded what we predicted and imagined, so I think that was just incredible. And the other thing about Episode 3, like I said, is how did Vader become more machine than man? And we didn't know at the time. We just imagined maybe it happened over time. Maybe he lost an arm, then a leg, or was he cut in half? Who knows? We just didn't know. And to find out Ben did that, and like in one swoop like that, that really adds depth to Ben's character. And then when you know he meets Luke, who is Vader's son, and he says all these things, and he's the one that did it, it just adds so much dimension to him. And that was, again, I think better than most of us imagined. I think we had been imagining it happened in wars and fights between various Jedis over time, but to learn it happened like that, that was really satisfying. And there was nothing, for me, in Episodes 1 and 2 that we learned that we had been wondering so much about. I mean, I'm sure if I sat here and thought about it in detail, there were a couple of reveals, but there were also a couple of things that didn't work, like how Vader built C-3PO. Didn't work so well for me. It's just kind of unnecessary. It makes the galaxy seem a little bit smaller. We see Boba Fett as a kid, which I'm kind of on the fence with. I'd rather just keep that character totally mysterious. And we got the midi-chlorians, which nobody was wondering about. We just kind of wanted to keep the Force mysterious. That goes into a kind of a separate video, because now George Lucas told us about the theory of the wills. But the point is, we got a few things we weren't really wondering about and weren't welcoming, and obviously Jar Jar, and a few other things that were a little bit cheesy. To get back on point, I also think that 3 had probably the best acting, although that's not saying much, and it did have a few emotional scenes, and one of the scenes I really like, that I always think about, that I always watch over and over, is when Ben comes to Padme sometime in the final act of the movie, and he says something like, Anakin's the father, isn't he? And I think she just nods or says yes or something, you're gonna find him, but there wasn't too much dialogue, and Ben just says, I'm sorry, and he walks off. You know, they didn't have this thing, they didn't get into the conversation, she didn't try to stop him too much. I know, she says like a one-liner, but he just leaves, and definitely an emotional scene, so I really like that scene. So there's a lot to say, and this isn't a movie review, but my bottom line is I will defend 3 because I just want to make sure people start saying, you know, if you do think that the Disney movies are better than the prequels, I guess that's your opinion, but I think people should start acknowledging that 3 is very different from 1 and 2 in terms of how well the execution of the movie is and how satisfying it is as a Star Wars movie. So if you're listening up to this point, consider subscribing. You can click my Super Ray Sue icon to subscribe. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I will see you next time.